But without further ado, give you Anthony Reimer.
Morning, everyone. As I just said, I recommend you either use that repo with all the resources, or you can always do the fun thing of sit near the front. Whatever suits your fancy. My talk today is on writing and understanding AutoPkg recipes. Boy, we're off to a good start. Basically, the process that I'm going to use today is I'm going to do some terminology up front. I'm going to create a couple recipes in front of you. I'm going to show you a basic testing workflow that I use, very basic, and I'm going to do an examination of the Microsoft Office recipes. There's more than one family out there, and they have lots of things they can teach us. I'm going to go through at least a couple of those things. But since you paid the freight to get here, I want to make sure that I tailor as much of this talk to you, the audience, as possible, because quite frankly, I have way more than 50 minutes of content to go through. So I want to know what I can speed through and what I can't. So show of hands, how many of you can code in Python? Pretty good. How many of you have written a custom processor for AutoPkg? Let's say Greg, and I'll have to learn you. Feel free to apply to do the follow-up session for this next year as a speaker, writing custom processors for AutoPkg. I'm going to talk about why you might want to do it, but I'm not going to teach you how to do that today, because I can't do it. How many of you have written your own recipes using whatever method, even if it's the copy from something else, written your own recipes for AutoPkg? Okay, great. You may have some things you want to share if I do have time at the end to add to what I have to say. How many of you have just used the recipes of others in AutoPkg? How many of you haven't used AutoPkg at all yet? Okay, so for those people, boy, do I have something for you to watch once you're done here. Greg Nagel, who happens to be in the room, did a great fundamental presentation at MacSysAdmin in Sweden 2 weeks ago. The video is already up. And for my mind, it is now the fundamental talk about how you get up to speed in AutoPkg, why you'd want to use it, and if you've been just an AutoPkgr user and you really haven't dove into the command line, Greg goes through everything on the command line, and it's really straightforward. And you can find some extra functionality there as well. So I definitely recommend you watch that. And in fact, some of today's talk will make more sense after you do that. So let's talk about recipes, terminology-wise. We talk about AutoPkg recipes much the same way we talk about something you do for cooking or baking. Just like those recipes, there are standard sections or components, and AutoPkg, those recipes have similar components. The process array is where all the work gets done. Everything else is just set up, right? So you might have different preparation methods like in a cookbook. But here's a very basic recipe, and I want to make sure we're all on the same page as far as what's up there. Standard doc type definition for a plist, description, tell you a little about the recipe, an identifier that uniquely identifies that recipe, usually in reverse domain sequence. Then input, that's where all the variables are. By convention, there's always a name variable in the first recipe of the string. And at one time, there were some processors that were dependent on having name in there. They would break if you didn't have that input variable. I think those are mostly gone, but it's still convention to have that. It's generally useful. And then the minimum version. 1.0 is generally a great minimum version to use now because most of the additional functionality that we got in trust verification, for example, some of the extra processors are all there by 1.0. But if you use something that was added to the project after 1.0, then you should increment that number to reflect that. And of course, all the work gets done in the process array, where you can have one or more processors doing steps. So pretty clear, right? Those of you who worked with AutoPkg for a long time, that's no news. We can categorize recipes in a couple ways. We can categorize them by function. So it downloads, it makes a package, it feeds our management system, right? But we can also categorize it by relationship. And when I was talking about download package monkey, we often have parent-child relationships. And that's one of the beautiful things about AutoPkg. It's a value of the AutoPkg community to share. And so while you could write a recipe monolithically, you know, monolithic is a bad word in AutoPkg too, by running like 5 or 6 steps and just be done, generally we break out the download portion and then say parent, download is the parent, the package recipe is the child, and then as you can see, any child recipe can be a package, any child recipe can become a parent, because then the one to feed your management system like Monkey can call one of the other ones. The other type of recipe I've mentioned there is override. Override is just terminology-wise a very specific type of child recipe. It used to be that was where the reason you had an override was to specify your own input variables. Now that's where trust verification information is stored. So that's really the main distinguisher nowadays for what an override is. Of course, it's in the recipe overrides folder, and it has a higher priority to run, but that's the main distinguisher. If you are looking at a recipe and you want to figure out whether it's a parent, child, or an override, those are the components that are by default there or not there. But in the end, they're all just recipes. Any recipe can be used, as I said, any package recipe can become a child. Any parent recipe, any recipe can become a parent. There we go. Okay, vocabulary out of the way. The easiest way probably to learn how to write a recipe is to actually just do it, and then understand the easiest way to understand a recipe is to write one. So let's look at the methods we commonly use to create recipes. I know of 3 ways. This is the most common. You take someone else's recipe, adapt it for your purposes. I do want to point out, though, if you're using some older recipes, there have been some new processor additions. App Package Creator is one I would really like to highlight. It used to take 3 or 4 processor steps to take an app in a disk image and make it into a package, because some management systems require it. But we now have this new processor. So if you are liberating a recipe for your use in another recipe, make sure you're looking at a modern one. There may be more modern alternatives that are more efficient and easier for you to maintain. Another tool is Recipe Robot. It was part of a MacBrain Hack the Mac project, and it is currently maintained. You can run on the command line or with a GUI. And I found it useful for recipes that, for example, use Sparkle to update themselves. It's a quicker way for me to spelunk where all the links I need, the feed links are. So I generally tweak the recipes that Recipe Robot generates, so I find it is a good starting spot for certain tasks. And of course, you could just write it from scratch, which until recently was a bit of a task. And I was, I think Per Olesen, who originally started AutoPkg, he may be the only one that ever wrote one from scratch. I was talking to Greg at lunch yesterday, and he wasn't sure that he'd ever written one without, from scratch. But recently, the new recipe verb was added. So we're going to go whole hog, and we're going to write a new recipe using the new recipe verb. And in fact, that example I showed you to show you what the component parts were, so you understood how to read the recipe, that was generated by the new recipe verb. I just tweaked a couple things in the description. So recently I was asked to deploy ClipGrab. ClipGrab is a YouTube downloader GUI front end, basically, for the YouTube DL command line tool. So first of all, I want to find out, do I actually need to write a recipe? There are lots of recipes out there. This was my last count. In that presentation I mentioned earlier, Greg said that there were 2,600 unique products. So the chances of you finding a match are pretty good. And yet, as you can see, recipes still increase over time. So using this command at the command line, let's see if we can find me a recipe for clip grab. Great, there's the result. There's a download recipe, a Fowler Wave recipe, and a monkey recipe in two different repos, and even it's nice enough to tell us how to add that repo to our local copy so that we can run it if we so choose. My management system requires a package. So I'm going to need to at least write a child recipe from the download recipe. So I added Péché recipes, written by Andreas Hubert in Germany. I added his repo to mine and took a look at the recipe. So here's the top of the recipe. Of particular interest in this recipe are the two input variables, name, which we expect, and then he had OS. And then he used XML comments, which I've highlighted in orange here, to say, here's the values you should use, depending on whether you're downloading the Mac OS version, the Windows version, or the Linux version. He documented them in line using XML comment. Generally, my tendency is more to put that in the description into the human readable part, but this is syntactically correct. It's absolutely clear what you as the user of the recipe are going to want to do. So whatever standard you like to set. Here's the rest of the recipe. This is a pretty common pattern for a download recipe. We use URL text searcher to find the recipe, find the link for the download. Then you use URL downloader to download said link. And then as a courtesy for those who are running AutoPkg using the check flag, tell them that we're finished checking for new versions. Anything after this we don't have to do. So let's deconstruct this a bit. The URL text searcher processor, the argument for what page to look at was clipgrab.org. How many of you used URL text searcher for writing a recipe? Not many? Anyway, for me, it's one of the core ones. If you can't have a feed, if there's a place that shows you where the download is and the company always updates it, then this is where you go. So there's our link. Free download gives that. And so what I did is I need to now look at the HTML to know how to find where to get that. So in this case, I'm going to show you what it looks like when you use Safari, but you could use Firefox. You could just download the HTML file and open it up in your favorite text editor to figure out what it's like. For demonstration purposes, I did it this way, and in that blue highlighted area, I'm looking for that string you see at the bottom of the screen now. That's the download link we're looking for. So let's see how Andreas grabbed it in his recipe. So he used a regular expression, and I'd love for someone to actually do a session on regular expressions. It's a broad topic, and so I can't really dig into it that much. But you see there, what he's done is he's said, there's the link, and I'm going to search for everything up to the end double quote, because that's not going to be, I know that's where it ends. I don't have to worry about, is it a digit, is it a dot, anything. He just does a capture the bit until it's not a double quote, and that's what we want. He's also added one other thing. He's added parentheses, and in this case, that means the processor will only output what's in the parentheses. There are some interesting tricks you can do with this in URL text searcher. You can not have the parentheses at all, in which case it'll return absolutely everything, and many recipes do that. Some also put a question mark P flag in, and I'd learned it by looking at someone else's recipe. But that's a way you can capture more than one value with this URL text searcher processor. Only reason that he added the extra function right below that, ignore case, is because he's doing cross-platform, and for some reason the developer used mixed case for the Mac version, but for the Windows version it's all lowercase. Who knows why, but he's trying to capture them all, so that's it. And then you'll notice also, I forgot to mention, that %OS%, that is where we substitute the input value that you suggested that was in the input so that we could get the disk image, so that way we get the Mac version. He's given a value for URL as the output for this processor. If he didn't put that in, the default is match, and it's all documented in the processor. But whether you specify that or not, unless there's a specific reason, it's a matter of style. So let's bring that back into context. We've now got the URL, actually in this case, we've not got the URL, we've got what he put in parentheses. He tacked it on to download.clipgrab.org and said download that. We then do the courtesy check for those running with the check flag, and we're done. So to sum out, this is what he did. And that's a pretty common pattern for any download recipe. But there's something missing. Anyone know what it is? Greg. Code signature verification. Very good. In this case, there's actually a good reason for that. By chance, I happened to pick a very unusual recipe. It downloads recipes for products for more than one platform, right? Code verifying a Windows exe is not going to work. It's going to break, okay? So we have some choices about how we're going to proceed here. We could just use it as is, but it's really not best practice to not verify the code signature these days. We could create a pull request. We could add the code signature verifier to the recipe and tell Andreas, hey, please accept our pull request. Most of the time, that's actually a pretty good choice, but because he's written a cross-platform recipe, he's not going to accept the PR. We could write our own recipe. Just take what he had, add the code signature verifier, probably even throw away the OS variable because we don't need it anymore. We're only downloading for Mac OS. And that's a perfectly legitimate option, but for the purposes of this class, I'm going to choose option number 4. I'm going to write a child recipe. Leave his recipe as is, and just write a child recipe that just does the code signature verification. We will also call it download, but it has to be unique, so I'm going to call it clipgrab Mac instead of clipgrab down, just clipgrab. So here's the command I'd use if I was building that recipe using the new recipe command. So like I said, I was going to call it clipgrab Mac. The P flag there is to specify the parent. So I've got the identifier from the recipe you just saw, and I pasted it in. I also use the identifier flag here to give the identifier of my recipe. You don't have to do that. You can go into the edit when you're editing the recipe. You can just type it in. No difference either way. For me, this was just to remember that local.clipgrabMac is not a really unique identifier because that's what it'll default to. But it really doesn't matter which way you do it. So here's the recipe. I did promise small type, right? That's why if you want to go to the JazzAce repo on GitHub and look at it, you can look at it up close. So this is what it generated. What do we need to change? Well, let's go top to bottom. So we need to add a description. So I've said downloads the latest copy of clipgrab for Mac and verifies the code signature. And I've told you that it requires the Pesce recipes. I like to put dependencies in my description so everyone knows what you need to have. And again, if I'm using any funky input variables, I like to document them there as well. Now, in here, I changed the name from clipgrab Mac, which is what it did by default based on the recipe name, to just clipgrab because that's the name of the product. Adding Mac was simply for disambiguation. And in this one, I've set the OS input value to DMG. Now that happens to be the current default in his recipe, would have been okay if I left it out. But this kind of works like a mini override in that it sets the default value to DMG, and someone would have to do something really stupid when they created the override to not use this value, okay? And now we're adding code signature verification down in the process section. So you'll notice the name of the processor right now in the default format is at the bottom. I guess that is because arguments comes in the alphabet before processor, but I kind of like to read it processor name and arguments, so I'm just going to move that up. Great, so now it's time to get the code signature. This is documented both in the wiki and in the actual processor. You use one of these two commands to get the code signature, whether it's an app or whether it's a package. So clip grab comes as a disk image download. I mount it. That sure looks like an app. So I'm going to use the code sign command like so. And for ease, I just took that installer, dragged it, and dropped it on there. But because it's a mounted volume, that path is going to actually be, that would have been pretty easy to remember. So running that command gives me this. I did promise small type, right? But I've highlighted I made it a little bigger at the bottom. That's what we want for the code signature. Everything after the equal sign greater than that looks like an arrow, everything after like that will go into the argument there. And that is the requirement argument. It's a little different if you do a package, but it's documented. So the only thing left to do is tell it where to find the thing to verify. So the beauty of the URL downloader processor is it gives you an output value of path name that tells you exactly where on your local machine that disk image was downloaded, or whatever it downloaded. It's just in a variable. So I just start the path name with that, percentage path name percentage. And AutoPkg is smart enough to know that if you're looking at something inside a disk image, you can just extend the path, and it will know that it has to mount the disk image and then look inside it. So very simple syntax in this case, percent path name percent slash, and I just used star.app because it's a globbing character, it'll find it. If I wanted to be a little more precise, I could say clipgrab.app, because that's what's there. But if the developer ever changed it to, let's say, clipgrab3, it wouldn't find it. I could split the difference, go clipgrab_star.app. That might be a good compromise. Again, matter of style, matter of what you want to do to break it. Guess what? We're done. That's it. Do you think you could do that? You think you could make those little tweaks to either a blank recipe or someone else's recipe and make your own? Well, it's time to test it. Oh, we're doing pretty well for time. I might have some time at the end. So I'm just going to give you a very simple testing workflow, just kind of the minimum you want to do to make sure everything's working. If you want to see how I actually did it when I did this development, I didn't plan on doing this, but I actually just put into a text file the whole transcript of what I did, warts and all. I did a couple lookup for processor information and stuff like that. It's all there. I made a mistake on that first path that I just told you about for the path of where you're going to code signature verify. It's all there. The only thing you'll want to know, and I'll talk about it later, is I used a few shortcuts in there, some aliases in the terminal. But let me take you through what I did. I basically followed this one. I tested the original recipe, make sure it still works, the one I'm basing mine off. I tested my child recipe, and then because there's a different behavior after the first download, because in theory, if you download it right after, you ask right after that, it's not going to need to be updated. I want to test that as well, right? The AutoPkg run verb, in fact, every verb, in fact, just AutoPkg, has a help option, and it'll tell you all the lovely options you can use when you use the run command. I'm going to focus on these three. Let's start with ignoring trust verification. I could do a whole talk on trust verification. In fact, if you want to see a whole talk on trust verification, watch Elliot Jordan's talk, particularly the one from Penn State MacAdmin's 2017. But to keep it simple, I'm just going to say that I always run AutoPkg with strict trust verification on, and I recommend that you do too. It means if something changes behind the scenes, such as a repo is updated or even something gets corrupted on your computer, your recipe will stop running and will require your attention, which is a really good security posture, right? That's why we have trust verification. Without this set, you'll just get a warning if you're watching it go by in the terminal. It'll just say, hey, trust verification is, this doesn't have trust verification. It's a warning, it will continue. So that's why I like having this explicitly set. The wiki page you see on the screen does have more details. However, for those of us who are writing recipes, and that's what we're talking about today, this can be a problem because it's incredibly tedious to get trust information, like build an override, change 2 or 3 characters, update the trust in the override, change 2 or 3 things as you're debugging. You could see how this could become very tedious, right? So for testing purposes, I turn trust off. Now I used to use the persistent method you see there. Either one of those will work. You don't have to use them both. But being a human being, I would forget to turn it back on sometimes. So now I use the per run method with the relatively recent ignore parent trust verification errors option. And that way, it's just off for that run. Now, I don't want to type that every time, so I have an alias in my shell. And you'll notice that I've also put in the verbose flag. I like 2 levels of verbosity. It generally is a nice balance between the information you need without having to spin through too much about your AutoPkg installation. So for debugging, I like that. You can see where all the input and output variables are going, very useful for debugging. If I just type that in the command, it'll be good for that session. If you want to type it in, if you wanted to have it every time, I know I have a list of aliases, and in fact, if you go through my transcript, you'll see that I use some other ones, like I just use AP for AutoPkg, APPI for AutoPkg, processor info, things I use commonly. You can just put them in your home directory under .bash_profile, .bashrc, or if you're one of those trailblazers who's running Catalina, .zshrc. It's an invisible file, but text editors like BBEdit will have no problem finding it. Just like a shell script, 1 command per line, you can do other things to customize your environment as well. The other thing I like that's valuable for testing is the package option. This is particularly useful when you have a working download recipe like we just showed, and you want to test the rest of the chain without having to download the thing again and again. If you have a situation where it's like the Microsoft Office recipes, why would you want to download 800 megabytes every time just to test if your recipe is working? Especially later parts of it, getting into your management system, building a package, anything else like that. So this is a very useful option to add, and even though it's called the package option, it could be a package, or like in this case, it was a disk image. You can specify either after that package option. So let's test that new clip grab recipe that I just took you through. Excuse me. Here's the command, expanded out, not with the alias, that I used to check the parent download recipe. And this is what it generated. I've highlighted the things that are of most interest to us. But like I said, there's lots of good learning to go into if you look at all the verbosity. We run URL text searcher. We run URL downloader. It downloads it, end of check phase. Okay? And that's just running the original parent recipe, because I said that's what I was going to do first, right? works fine. This is the spot where now that we have the download, this is the spot where you might add the package option when you're doing your testing now the child recipe. But now we're going to test the recipe I wrote. Okay? Looks like it runs successfully. It did the 3 processors from the parent recipe plus code signature verifier. Great, that's how it's supposed to work. That's how a parent-child relationship works. Fantastic. Everything is good. So let's run it again. And I hope most of you would know that you can run the last shell command you just had by typing bang bang. So this is what it generates this time. Same 4 processors, but during the URL downloader, it says the URL item is unchanged. So nothing downloaded, packaged, or imported. Success! See, we can do that. That's fantastic. So I've got that written. I'm ready to start writing my package recipe. So in the interest of time, it's going to be like we talked about baking. It's going to be like a baking show. You come back 30 minutes later, and it's done. But just to highlight, this one was particularly easy to write because the output for the URL downloader had all the default values that we needed for App Package Creator. I think the person who created App Package Creator knew this and put really kind and smart defaults in place. So I don't even need any arguments because the defaults are all good. Okay? You may need to change them yourself, but in this case, it's a very simple 1 processor, no arguments recipe calling the parent that we just wrote. Again, I think this is something that a lot of people can do without much problem. So I want to spend the rest of my time talking about the Office recipes and the role of custom processors. I forgot I'm in the United States, just say processors. Just to be clear, we've already kind of touched on it, but processors are just little bits of Python code. There are a bunch of core processors, 42 of them to be exact. But sometimes you need functionality other than that. And so a custom processor is one someone writes to provide additional functionality. Because AutoPkg needs to know where it is to run it, you normally place it in the same directory as the recipe. If it's a more general purpose one, ones I can think of are File Finder and Version Splitter, actually Version Splitter specifically by Elliot Jordan. You can write a stub recipe just to establish an identifier for it. And to be clear, a stub recipe basically does nothing. There are many ways you can talk about a stub recipe, but in this case, it provides an identifier. You put it in the same directory as where your custom processor is, and then it becomes a shared processor because using the syntax from the wiki page, you can actually, basically it's the identifier of the stub recipe / the name of the processor. You can run any processor that AutoPkg can find. The wiki also lists a bunch of noteworthy shared processors that you might want to leverage. I know I've found that they come in handy fairly often. So why would we want to delve down the road of writing a custom processor? Well, sometimes the situation is just too complex. And if you know how to write Python, like some people in the room do, it's easier. You can make something that's completely customized to what you're talking about, right? That will make it so, for example, an input variable, you can just say download the latest or download the the ESR version like in Firefox. You can make it so it's human readable and it's very useful. Sometimes it's also the most efficient way to do it. And we'll see an example of that in a moment. And sometimes you're just adding features that's not in the core product. On the flip side, you need to know Python. And if you don't know Python, you still have to know how to kind of audit it or test it in order to make sure that you're willing to run it in production in your environment. At least with the core processors, you've had hundreds, if not thousands, of people running those processors And you can, I would think that's fairly trustworthy. So I'm not saying at all that you should not use custom processors, but you really, through the whole idea of trust, you really should vet them. Finally, if you do write a custom processor, people will expect you to maintain it. So that's another disadvantage. Microsoft Office right now has 3 what I would call major sets of recipes available, and they all use a little bit of different approach with regards to custom processors. And so I think I want to spend the rest of the time just breaking that down. This is how I'll refer to them: the core recipes, Rich Troughton set of recipes, and the effort that started around the 2016 recipes hosted by Alistair Banks. Notice that this is one of those repos that is outside the project, at least the most current, well-written as far as the custom processor is. It's in that repo. So I'll refer to them in shorthand either by the name or by the repo. So let's go back to the common download recipe workflow from earlier, now that we've added code signature verification. Custom processor might come in handy to determine where we got the download from. So we already have these core processors available to us to find stuff. I showed you URL text searcher, but for Sparkle and GitHub feeds, that's pretty common. Those are very useful processors. But Microsoft, what do they use? Microsoft Auto Update, right? So this makes for a great idea for the core processors. They use that mechanism to get what you need. The big plus of this is it exposes insider releases that you really can't get any other way. The downside, if that product is not updated by Microsoft Auto Update, it can't see it. So that's the approach that the core recipes use. And it's very sophisticated, and again, it has that ease of use through the input variables. The Rich Troughton and Alistair Banks recipes take a different approach since they focus on the full product downloads exclusively, and that's a bit of a background about their history is why they do that. Here's a page on Microsoft's site where you can download full products. I hover over a link here, and you can see that the link has a particular form, and in fact, it's consistent. Everything other than the 6 or 7 digit number at the end, that's consistent. Microsoft has a redirect system that will go to their content delivery network and point it through a browsing system. So that's what those 2 sets of recipes use. They don't even have to worry about figuring out where the URL is. They just figure out what the FW link number is for their product that they want in the recipe. They either put it as an input variable, they could hard code it, but in the case of Microsoft products, you're writing one recipe that you can then build to support all the products, right? So they just use an input variable, and then they just substitute that into the URL, much like we did in the clip grab recipe. So simple. 2 different approaches. They both work. They both do slightly different things depending on what you need, but you can see how you can do it with a custom processor or without. So there's one more factor to consider, which is sometimes done in a download recipe, but can also appear later, like in a version, like a package recipe or a recipe to get into your later in the chain. Anyone know what's missing or what you'd commonly want to do before you get it into your management system? How about figure out what version it is so that your management system knows this is a new one, right? So versioning is the other piece of the puzzle that we need to figure out. So let's figure out how we can figure out what the version is. Well, there are core processors that do it, but you could also write a custom processor depending on what's exposed or what's not. But in this case, Microsoft is nice enough to give us a package to download, so these core processors don't apply. So 2 of the sets of recipes chose to write a custom processor. In the case of the core recipes, the same processor that they used for finding out the URL, because the XML feed had the URL and the version number ending in a build number right beside it, particularly efficient to just go grab them at the same time. One XML feed, get all the information you need. Perfect. Works great. In the Alistair Banks recipes, they got it using the FW link number, but it's like, so how do we get the version? Well, he went to a page that is an XML feed handcrafted by Paul Bowden, where Paul Bowden at Microsoft. So there is a risk that it could get out of sync, but it was the only method you could use to get the 16.29.0 instead of 16.29.build. So if you really wanted that format, that more marketing number, then that's the method you used. Now, Rich Troughton took an entirely different approach. I did say there would be small text, didn't I? This 91-line recipe is actually a package recipe. So it calls the download recipe, and its sole purpose is to take the package that we already downloaded, determine the version of the app it will use, and append that version number. For something that's easier to read, the process he did was it's ingenious. He downloaded the product. I'm going to use Excel in this instance. He unpacked the installer. He used the file finder processor. Sorry, I misspoke earlier. File finder is a core processor. He used that to look, because there are now multiple packages inside that expanded packages. One of them has Excel and it has the actual app in it. So he said, find that one, unpack that one. Now you have the Excel app, run the versioner processor on it. Because we don't have a rename processor, what he did was he used the copier processor and renamed it Microsoft_Excel_version number by making a copy and saying that is the name of the new copy. And then he cleans up after himself. He deletes everything we expanded. He actually deletes the original download that we just copied because it's going to be big, right? You don't want to have an extra 800 megs sitting around in your AutoPkg repo that you don't need. Really ingenious solution, but an entirely different tack. And this is what I really find interesting about studying these recipes, because you can find that there's more than one way to do it. And we can learn what's applicable to you when you're trying to develop your own recipes to figure out what's the best solution. Now, I believe it or not, I've written a lot more about those office recipes. There's lots to learn, and you can read about them on my blog. There are the three most recent articles are the ones that I've done specifically on Office. I have other AutoPkg articles. You just look for the little package emoji, and that's where you'll find them. As well, there are lots of good resources in the AutoPkg wiki, the AutoPkg channel in MacAdmin Slack, and I have to remember that I ran into someone yesterday who didn't know what the MacAdmin Slack was or that it existed. So if you are one of those people, before you leave the conference, go to macadmins.org, sign up, and talk about get close to 30,000 of your favorite MacAdmins and learn from them. And if the discussion needs to be longer, you'll often see something in the AutoPkg channel being punted to the AutoPkg discussion list. That's where major discussions happen, especially if you're involved in the development. So those three are all good resources for using AutoPkg. And I made it in time. That's amazing. Once again, there are the resources from the session. If you want to contact me, feel free to catch me anytime during the conference. I'm one of those people that's unlikely to come up to you. So if you see me at lunch, you see me at dinner, feel free to ask me questions. I know any of the other people you saw in the room who had hands up earlier that have done stuff. I'm sure they would help. It's a very friendly community that way. We actually have time for questions, do we? Anyone have any questions? Anyone feel like they can write a recipe now? Fantastic. Yeah, and really the copy someone else's or look at someone else's is really a really good methodology. Anyone have something to share that they want to add to the discussion? Okay.
I'll just add that
Sure.
I found your blog post very helpful. I found your blog post very helpful. Probably whenever Office 365 came out. So
Yeah.
thank you for that.
Well, thanks. I was trying to sort it out myself, and that's what we do, right? Other people take the lead at different times, but thank you for saying that.
I'm assuming there's resources for the Adobe installers.
There are AutoPkg recipes. I would point you to the Adobe channel specifically, because certain things under the new system don't work. The new, 2019 and later. But yes, there used to be some that worked really well. I haven't been using them lately because of the change. So, but there are some. At this point, since I say someone in central IT does it, but someone in central IT does it. I used to do it myself for my labs because I was keeping up more, but now they have, because it's portal based, I would need more access than I actually have right now. So I haven't had to dig into that yet. Fantastic. Well, what I'm going to do is there is going to be a quick talk here right now for the next 10 minutes or 5 or 10 minutes. And then there's stuff in the other rooms at 10 o'clock as well. So I'm just going to leave it at that. And thank you very much, everyone.